Over this past weekend, teams saw their playoff stock rise with massive wins, while other teams played themselves out of the playoffs entirely. Last week, I made a video looking at every team's chance to make the playoffs by separating them into these 5 categories, starting with mortal locks. These teams have wrapped up their spot in the playoffs regardless of their remaining games. Then locks barring collapse. These teams have spots waiting for them in the playoffs, but if they completely forget how to play football and lose out, there's a world where they tumble out of the playoffs, control their own destiny. These teams have the opportunity to win out and ensure their ticket to the playoffs. Need a little luck. Winning out isn't enough for these teams. They also need some results elsewhere to lock up their spots. And lastly, the prey tier. This is full of teams that not only need to win out, but also need miracles to happen across the sport. But firstly, let's start by looking at the teams that have unfortunately seen their playoff hopes crushed over this past weekend. Starting with Washington State, it was always going to be a tough hill to climb for the better half of the Pac-12, because even if they won out at 11-1, their horrific strength of schedule still probably would have kept them out of the playoffs. But a loss now to 5-6 New Mexico sealed their fate, and deservedly so. This team was already in the prey tier, but I mean, come on, Wazoo. The committee probably would have kept you out, but at least give yourself a chance. Next, we have Louisville. Another prey tier team that needed the ACC to pretty much implode in on itself to somehow make the ACC championship, but I guess it wasn't meant to be, as they went and lost to 2-win Stanford while being 20.5-point favorites. If you happened to watch this game, then you know the ending was one of the most disastrous things to ever happen on a football field. Louisville somehow managed to lose the game from this position in regulation without throwing a pick or fumbling. From the Stanford 45, they tried some big passes until it was 4th and 10 with 11 seconds left. You'd figure they'd probably just punt the ball to Stanford to have them kneel on it and send the game to OT, right? Well, wrong. Instead, they decide to go for it, fail, and give Stanford the ball back with a few seconds. Stanford then proceeded to complete a short pass that got flagged for unsportsmanlike conduct against Louisville, moving them into a 57-yard field goal try. If that wasn't bad enough, they then jumped off sides to make the field goal even easier on the kicker, where he buried a 52-yarder for the win. Maybe some of the worst coaching and most boneheaded flags I've ever seen in a football game. I can't even imagine the frustration Louisville fans everywhere had to be feeling watching this game. But, all that aside, this ending ruined the already slim chance that Louisville had at the playoffs. Moving on to our first group of 5 team that is now out of the race, we have Louisiana. I was rooting for Louisiana this past weekend because I live for the group of 5 madness, but this was a tough game to watch. Louisiana went down huge to South Alabama to the point where they were being blown out 3-24 by half. By the 4th quarter, it was only 6-24, and it looked all but wrapped up. But then Louisiana mounted a miraculous 4th quarter comeback, scoring to make it 22-24, but failing the 2-point conversion by inches to lose the game. It reminded me of that Permian game at the end of the Friday Night Lights movie, just a brutal loss to end their playoff hopes. Next, we got LSU. Now, LSU by no means has had a bad season. They've had a really tough schedule and even picked up a win over Ole Miss, but the slip-ups caught up with them this weekend with a loss against Florida. Honestly, LSU was pretty unlucky to play Florida this late in the year, as they're just getting settled in with their quarterback DJ Lagway. Either way, this is a game you have to win if you want to make the playoffs, and with it being their 4th loss, they're out for sure. The last team that had a chance before the weekend but is now out is Missouri. First, let me just say, what a game. Missouri played at South Carolina with both teams needing a win to keep their hopes alive, and I don't think I was alone in thinking it would be a relatively easy contest for South Carolina. And while it may have started that way, the end of this game was spectacular. Missouri took the lead by 1 with 9 minutes left, but then South Carolina answered back with a touchdown and failed 2-point conversion to go up by 5. Just before Luther Burden caught an insane 4th down pass to give the lead back to Missouri with about a minute to go. With 27 seconds left on their own 40, South Carolina was fighting for their season, just needing a field goal to send it to OT. With both teams' seasons on the line, Missouri's defense completely folded, allowing South Carolina to score for the win. Heartbreak on one side and elation on the other. Truly what college football is all about, and if you saw it live, you know just how insane it was. Now let's move over to the teams still hopeful to make the playoffs, starting with the mortal locks. Last week I had Oregon and Ohio State in this tier, but this week I just have Oregon. Oregon is the only team in college football that could lose their remaining games and still be a lock for the playoffs. A big reason for that is because they only have one regular season game left while most teams have two. Oregon is coming off of quite the scare against Wisconsin, which probably has a lot of people wondering if they're frauds. Penn State and Alabama beat the brakes off Wisconsin when they played in Madison, but Oregon really struggled. I think Oregon is still a solid playoff team, but questions have to be raised on how you're barely beating a team by a field goal when their quarterback is under 100 yards in the game and averaged 3.4 yards per throw. For the sake of this video, they're still a mortal lock, but there's a reason they don't have the best odds to win it all. That honor actually falls to the team kicking off locks barring collapse, Ohio State. Ohio State just pummeled Northwestern at Wrigley Field, but the reason I downgraded them was because even though I believe they will win out, there is still a possibility that they lose to a good Indiana team this weekend, and then fall to a Michigan team that, let's face it, is ass this year. However, regardless of the teams year on year, that rivalry is so heated and filled with so much hatred that games usually remain closer than you would expect. If Ohio State loses out, they would have 3 losses, miss the Big Ten championship, and more than likely miss the playoffs. For that reason, I can't have them in mortal locks, but they're the closest thing to it, and with a win this weekend, they'll get in. Next, we have Texas. They're staying in this tier, but you guys raised some good points in the comments of my last video. I said that even with a loss to Texas A&M at the end of the season, Texas 100% gets in, and that actually might not be the case. Look at the current SEC standings. South Carolina is still in the race, but we'll speak on them later. For now, let's look at all the teams with just 2 losses or less. More than likely, at least one of these teams and potentially 2 will miss the playoffs. However, Texas against Texas A&M is the only ranked matchup remaining for any of these teams. Every team outside of Texas and Texas A&M is expected to win out, which would leave the committee in a bit of a bind. Are they going to drop the team they have ranked 3rd completely outside the playoffs if they lose to 15th ranked Texas A&M? I honestly think they will, especially if Ole Miss, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee all win out. The reason they're in this tier and not control their own destiny is because I would consider a loss to Texas A&M quite the upset. Texas should be favored by more than a score, and while this is college football and we've seen crazier things happen, they would have to play themselves out of the playoffs rather than in at this point. A new addition to this tier is Georgia. They did exactly what they needed to do on Saturday, shutting Tennessee out in the second half and winning by 2 scores. Going into this game, a lot of people were worried about Carson Beck's play due to the fact he only had 2 touchdown throws in his 3 games prior, while throwing 7 interceptions during that same time. However, Beck settled himself here, throwing for 350 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no picks. Georgia was in control of their own destiny, but now they've moved up because they're done with SEC play and only have UMass and Georgia Tech on their schedule. It would take one of the biggest collapses we've ever seen for them to lose one of these games. And their record at 10-2 in the SEC would probably be the strongest due to their current strength of schedule being number 1 in the country. Should they win out and lose in the SEC championship game, I believe the committee would still let them in, because I just can't see them leaving off a Georgia team with their losses coming at Bama, at Ole Miss, and in the SEC championship game, especially with wins at Texas, against Tennessee, and against Clemson. If a team like Texas A&M, on the other hand, gets in and loses in the SEC championship, receiving their 3rd loss, it could be a different scenario, but more on that later. Looking over to the Big Ten, we have Penn State. They kicked the shit out of Purdue this past weekend, and now have an away game against Minnesota, before hosting Maryland in their last game of the season. They're currently 12.5-point favorites against Minnesota, and should also be double-digit favorites against Maryland, which is why they find themselves in this tier. Not much more to say about this team. The only way they get into the Big Ten championship game is if they win out and have Ohio State beat IU and then lose to Michigan. Should Penn State lose one of their last 2 games, they'll be out of the playoffs, but it'll take a major upset for that to happen. The last Big Ten team we are going to be talking about is Indiana. Nothing has really changed here as they're coming off their last bye week, but I have them as the last team in locks barring collapse because there is a chance to get left out even if they don't technically collapse. And that, of course, is if they get whooped this weekend against Ohio State in Columbus. While I think an 11-1 Indiana gets in, if they lose by, say, 35 points to Ohio State, it would be up to the committee to decide if they've done enough to earn their spot, or if it would be better used on a 2 or 3 loss SEC team. All eyes will be on that Ohio State game this weekend, and if they can just keep it close and do what they have to do against Purdue, they shouldn't be on the hot seat for the final seedings. Moving on to the teams slightly lower that control their own destiny, Starting with the ACC, we have both SMU and Miami. Miami had a bye following their loss to Georgia Tech, so not a lot has changed. But Clemson won their game against Pitt this week, which turns up the pressure a little bit. For weird ACC scheduling purposes, Clemson is done with their ACC games, sitting with a nice record of 7-1. Unfortunately for them, that one loss came to Louisville, who Miami beat earlier in the year. That win gives Miami the tiebreaker over Clemson. So if they win their next 2 games against Wake Forest and Syracuse, they're into the ACC championship no matter what, with a record of 7-1. Moving over to SMU, the news doesn't get any better for Clemson. Because guess which common opponent SMU beat earlier this year? Yeah, that's right, Louisville. Really tough break for Clemson, but that means SMU, who just had a pretty close game against mediocre Boston College, can drop one of their 2 remaining games to either Virginia or Cal and still end up in the ACC championship game. Looking elsewhere, we have the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They just kicked Virginia's teeth in and currently sit in the driver's seat of their own destiny. After being shocked in week 2 by NIU, with people saying their season was over, they've quietly put together a nice year, beating on everyone in their way, even if everyone in their way can be considered really weak. I think their resume is heavily propped up on their week 1 victory at Texas A&M, which now gives them a very strong argument against those 2-loss SEC teams come end of the season. There is no free ticket to the playoff waiting for Notre Dame. The only way in is through one of the 7 at-large spots. Luckily, if they take care of Army this weekend at Yankee Stadium and travel to Southern Cal to knock off USC, I just don't see any argument in leaving them out of the playoffs. Moving over to the SEC. Last week I said Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Texas A&M control their own destiny. And currently, everyone besides Tennessee still does. It was always going to be tough for Tennessee traveling to Athens, but their loss is going to knock them down a tier or 2, so we'll get to them later. As we already mentioned, their opponent, Georgia, has moved up. So that just leaves us looking at Alabama and Texas A&M in this tier for the SEC. Let's start with Alabama. The Tide just killed Mercer and now have Oklahoma and Auburn remaining on their schedule. Should they win out, they'll just need Missouri to pick up a win against either Mississippi State or Arkansas, or they would need Texas A&M to beat Texas in their last game of the season. Should either of these situations occur, assuming Bama wins out, they would be in the SEC championship game. However, would that even be something that Alabama wants? Playing for the conference title is great and all, but the real prize is the college football playoffs. And Alabama could potentially be exposing themselves to a 3rd loss and be left at the mercy of the committee. Personally, I think it would be ridiculous for the SEC loser to be left out regardless of who makes it, but it's not something to factor out completely. Looking at it objectively, a 10-2 Alabama with wins over Georgia, at LSU, and against somehow still ranked Missouri gets in every day of the week. But it feels like a 10-3 Alabama with a loss in the SEC championship game would somehow have worse odds of getting in. It's backwards and stupid, but something to think about. Texas A&M is a team that controls their destiny because if they win out, they're into the SEC championship game with a chance at securing a bye. They're coming off of their FCS game that SEC team scheduled late in the year where they beat New Mexico State. Despite this, Texas A&M actually has pretty low odds of making the college football playoffs because not only will they have to get through Texas in order to make the SEC championship game, but they'll also have to get through Auburn at their place this weekend where they're only favored by 2.5 points. Should they make and lose the SEC championship game, they would be 10-3 and the team with the best odds of getting royally screwed by the committee. I would hate to see it happen, but it's possible. Turning our attention to the Big 12, we have BYU and Colorado. Arizona State just barely doesn't control their destiny, so we'll get to them later. For BYU and Colorado, it's simple. Win out and you're in the Big 12 championship. Win that and you're in the college football playoffs. Easy peasy, right? Well, I'd actually argue not. BYU has one of the biggest tests this weekend in Tempe, where they're 3-point underdogs to Arizona State, who will be playing for their lives. A win there allows them to take a bit of a breather at home against 4-6 Houston. But let's not forget, this team just took out Kansas State 2 weeks ago. As for Colorado, they have Kansas this weekend, and we just saw them hand BYU their first loss of the season. This Kansas team is far better than their 4-6 record says, and they probably think they can take on anyone right about now. If Colorado can get through that, they can also take a bit of a breather against Oklahoma State, one of the more disappointing Big 12 teams. This would set up a head-to-head between Colorado and BYU for the Big 12 title, and that college football playoff spot. Should one of them lose though, things could get extremely wild in the Big 12. Now let's look at the Group of 5 frontrunner Boise State. I very nearly moved Boise State to Lock's Bar and collapse, but I just couldn't do it. They looked really shaky to start their game against San Jose State this past weekend, going down 14-0 and looking like they could get knocked off out of nowhere, but they settled in and won comfortably. The week before that, they only beat 3-win Nevada by 7. They've just had too many close scraps for me to call it a collapse if they lose during the regular season or in the Mountain West Championship. But do I think they're going to win out and win the Mountain West? Absolutely. They should manhandle 2-8 Wyoming, and Oregon State that closed the year shouldn't be too difficult either. That just leaves them to win the Mountain West, where they'll either face UNLV or Colorado State. Both games they would be favored in, but we'll touch on those teams later. The last team in this tier, moving up, is Army. I had them in need a little luck last video, but aside from the luck they need to beat Notre Dame, I do believe they technically control their own destiny. Maybe the most fun story of the year. A team of players committed to serving in the US military for at least 5 years after graduating is running the triple option down everyone's throats. As mentioned, they play Notre Dame at Yankee Stadium this weekend and find themselves as 14-point dogs. A win here would boost their odds tremendously, as they would have a real chance at taking Boise's group of 5 bid should they slip up. As much as it pains me, I wouldn't be surprised if the committee left out an undefeated Army over a team like 10-2 Tennessee due to Army's extremely weak schedule apart from Notre Dame. I think that would be completely wrong and against the entire point of the new playoff format, which is why I have Army in this tier, but it's something I have wrestled with when researching Army's path. But now, turning to what Army can control, the AAC championship game is already set in stone. It will be between Army and Tulane. If Army drops one to Notre Dame, beats UTSA, and wins the AAC, I believe they would just need Boise State to either drop a game in the regular season or have a team like Colorado State or UNLV win the Mountain West to get in. And that brings us to our needs a little luck tier. Let's start by talking about Ole Miss and Tennessee. Starting with Ole Miss, they just had a bye after their massive home win against Georgia. They finished this season with an easy path, being 10.5-point favorites against Florida this weekend and playing SEC punching bag Mississippi State in their last game. This could actually end up working against Ole Miss, and it's a big part of the reason they don't control their destiny. Ole Miss is one of the 2-loss SEC teams that will be on the bubble come Selection Sunday, and they're really out of chances to have a statement win to solidify their spot in the playoffs. Instead, they just have to hope that teams screw up around them while they take care of business, so they won't have to worry too much on that Sunday. It is still possible for them to make the SEC championship game, but the only path I could find is for Alabama to drop a game against either Oklahoma or Auburn, A&M to lose out against Auburn and Texas, and Vandy to beat Tennessee next week. Basically, they're out of the SEC championship game and just need to hope their 2-loss resume is good enough on Judgment Day. Looking over to Tennessee, I would be sweating a little bit if I was a fan of the Vols. The committee dropped them down to 11th on Tuesday after their loss to Georgia. Let me quickly break down how the race for the 7 at-large spots currently looks. For the sake of the argument, let's assume that only one ACC team and one Big 12 team make the playoffs, and all the favorites win their conference. That eliminates Oregon, Texas, Miami, and Colorado. I'm going to also just get rid of BYU and SMU here because they stand no chance of getting in with 2 losses unless a ton of these teams lose out. Sorry guys. That leaves just 7 spots for these 8 teams. At least one of the teams on your screen right now is not getting in. And as it stands, Tennessee is ranked 8th out of these 8 teams. Now, luckily for them, college football is one of the most chaotic sports around. So inevitably, it is likely that one of these teams shoots themselves in the foot and tumbles down, but it isn't guaranteed. One thing that is though, is Indiana playing Ohio State this weekend. Should Ohio State beat Indiana as they're favored to do so quite comfortably, that could be the opening that Tennessee needs to worm their way into the top 7. Personally, I believe Indiana would still have a better resume, as Tennessee lost to unranked Arkansas and would have a worse record, but that's probably just my Indiana bias talking. It would really come down to what the committee believes. But back to Tennessee. Before they can focus on that, they have to get through UTEP and Vanderbilt. I wouldn't hold my breath on getting in through the SEC championship, as this is the only path I could find for them to make it. It would take a really long time for me to explain all the tiebreakers for them to get in, but I wouldn't really worry about it because the odds are so insanely low. This team is most likely going to be nervous until hearing their name called on Sunday. We'll wrap up the SEC in the next tier, but for now let's take care of the ACC. The third and last team with a chance is Clemson. Similar to Georgia, Clemson has wrapped up their conference play and now has to see what happens with Miami and SMU. Clemson is a 2-loss ACC team, so getting an at-large bid is out of the equation. They need to sneak into the ACC championship. For this to happen, they need some games to fall their way due to the loss at Louisville we talked about, which gives SMU and Miami the tiebreaker over them. In short, Clemson needs either SMU to drop both of their games to 5-5 Virginia and 5-5 Cal. Unlikely. or they need Miami to lose just one more game. Miami plays Wake Forest this weekend as 24-point favorites. Not a great chance there, but hey, fellow ACC team Louisville dropped to Stanford last weekend as 20.5-point favorites, so anything's possible. It's far more likely for Miami to slip up in their next game to Syracuse, led by Ohio State transfer Kyle McCord. A loss there puts Clemson in the ACC championship, where a win will book their ticket to the playoffs. Now, moving over to a team that potentially saw their stock rise the most over the weekend, Arizona State. Last week, I didn't even give this team their own spotlight and just grouped them in with other Big 12 teams, but they have emerged as legit contenders to make the playoffs and nearly control their own destiny. This past weekend, they took down Kansas State as 7.5-point underdogs, but the big kicker was BYU's loss, which really opened the door for them. Now, a win over BYU this week would put them in a really good position to make the Big 12 championship. ASU would just need to beat Arizona and have BYU beat Houston next week in order to book their ticket. The last team in this tier is Tulane. They're in the AAC championship and only have one game remaining against Memphis after dismantling Navy last week. Obviously, they need to win out and take down Army in the AAC championship to stand a chance at grabbing that group of 5 spot in the playoffs. But they 100% need Boise State to completely drop the ball in the Mountain West. Should this happen, then either UNLV or Colorado State comes out of the Mountain West. Tulane would probably prefer Colorado State, as they'd easily get in over them, but UNLV is more interesting. Tulane is currently ranked 4 spots above UNLV in the college football playoff rankings that dropped on Tuesday, which makes it seem like Tulane would have the edge over them. But that doesn't factor in that UNLV would more than likely have to beat Boise State in order to win the Mountain West. It would then be up to the committee to decide if Tulane's win over Army would be enough to fend off UNLV's win over 12th ranked Boise State. Now moving into the Prey tier, why don't we just start with UNLV? They comfortably beat San Diego State and now have games against San Jose State and Nevada. UNLV needs to win out and needs Colorado State to drop one of their games against either Fresno State or Utah State. It's my understanding that the first tiebreaker in the Mountain West is head-to-head. UNLV lost to Boise, so that's a dead end, but they never played Colorado State. The second tiebreaker is college football playoff ranking, and since Colorado State has 3 losses, UNLV will definitely have them there. Even if they somehow make and win the Mountain West, they still need the winner from the AAC to have at least 2 losses. Up next, and our final SEC team with a chance, we have South Carolina. South Carolina's weakness is that they already have 3 losses, but they're easily one of the hottest teams in the country, coming off of 4 straight wins. They finished their season with Wofford this weekend and Clemson next. That Clemson game gives them a real chance to end on a hot note and cause some tough conversations to be had in the committee. But this is still a 3-loss team vying for an at-large bid. Chaos is their best friend at this point. South Carolina just needs teams above them to start crumbling. Indiana losing out, or Tennessee dropping one to Vandy, Ohio State losing to IU and Michigan. It doesn't matter, and South Carolina doesn't care. They just need enough madness to get their foot in the door. The SEC ending with such weak games doesn't do them any favors, but if it did, they wouldn't find themselves in the Prey tier. Now we have Iowa State. Iowa State just beat Cincy convincingly to keep their chances alive. As is the case with most teams down here, they must win out. They have Utah away this weekend and Kansas State at home the weekend after. Those are both their games to lose, but anything can happen. Winning out isn't enough though. Their easiest path to the Big 12 championship would be for Colorado and BYU to drop one of their remaining games apiece. Another path would be for BYU to beat ASU but fall to Houston. And their final path would be for ASU to beat BYU but lose to Arizona the week after. These would all get them into the Big 12 championship, where they would definitely get a spot in the playoffs with a win. And finally, in the darkest depths of the Prey tier, we have only Big 12 teams. While the Big 10 is nice and neat, with only like 2 or 3 scenarios that can play out to see who plays in Indy for the Big 10 championship, the Big 12 is probably one of the biggest shit shows I've ever seen at this point in the season. We already covered the 4 teams that have a decent shot to make the Big 12 championship, but now we have to look at the additional 5 teams that can make this game. Yes, there are a total of 9 teams still vying for their shot in the Big 12 championship, and for some reason, I am going to break down exactly how all of them can get there. Just to preface, all these teams are tied in the conference with a 4-3 record. So without any further ado, let's start with Baylor. This team started off their season with a 2-4 record, with their wins being over the only bad service academy in Air Force and Tarleton State, who does not even play FBS football. They somehow managed to turn their season around after winning their next 4 conference games, getting them to where they stand today. It should come as no surprise that all these teams have to win their remaining games to stand a chance. For Baylor, that means beating Houston and Kansas.
But wait! There's more!
They would then need either Colorado or BYU to lose out. These teams have pretty even remaining schedules, so I wouldn't say one is more likely to happen than the other, but I will say they're both pretty unlikely. But we are not done yet. Baylor would then need Iowa State and Arizona State to both drop one of their 2 remaining games. Unfortunately, Arizona State and BYU, as we have previously mentioned, play each other this weekend, meaning Baylor either needs ASU to win this game and then lose next week to Arizona, or lose this game, but then have Colorado be the team that loses out. They also need ISU to lose one against either Utah or Kansas State. Should all of this happen, they would be in. I should quickly mention the playoff implications here before jumping to the nenext team. Let's say 6-4 Baylor does the impossible and wins the Big 12. That would give them a record of 9-4. But remember, there is no rule stating that the 5 auto bids to the playoffs have to be given to the Power 4 conferences. Only Tulane and Army can win the AAC, and both of those teams are currently ranked, so it'd be tough to jump over one of them. And Boise State is currently poised to win the Mountain West with only 1 loss on their record. So not only do these teams need everything to go just right to win the Big 12, they also need other conferences to screw up their ends of the season. The best shot they have lies with Colorado State. Unfortunately for Colorado State, they have suffered 3 out-of-conference losses, so their playoff odds are basically non-existent. However, they find themselves undefeated in conference play in the Mountain West, and can make the Mountain West championship game if they win out. If Boise State beats Fresno State this weekend and Utah State next, then they'll have the chance to spoil Boise State's season with a win in the Mountain West championship. I believe this is pretty much the only scenario these long-shot Big 12 teams have to snake one of the auto bids for the playoffs. Alright, that was quite a lot to take in and understand, which is really stupid because the odds of all of this are insanely low. And speaking of horrible odds, let's see how Kansas State can sneak into the Big 12 championship, assuming they handle Cincinnati this weekend and Iowa State next. Very similar story here. They need BYU or Colorado to lose out again, but the only difference is that they need Arizona State and Baylor to lose one of their remaining games. Same exact path, just swapping out Iowa State for Baylor. The key difference is that Kansas State is the only team down here with a record of 7-3, which means jack shit for actually making the Big 12 championship, but could give them a much needed boost over other conference winners should they find a way to actually win. Now let's move over to TCU. If you thought K-State or Baylor had rough odds, wait till you hear this. It was hard to even find articles talking about how they could get into the Big 12 championship. And it took me, I shit you not, 10 minutes of fiddling with different outcomes before landing on what I believe may be TCU's only path. They need to be locked in a 5-way tie between BYU, Texas Tech, Arizona State, and Colorado. This means, after they win out against Arizona and Cincinnati, they need both BYU and Colorado to lose out. ASU would then need to lose to Arizona after beating BYU, and Texas Tech would have to win over Oklahoma State and West Virginia. If this perfect storm occurs, TCU would somehow find themselves thrusted into the second highest spot in the 5-way tie, where they would play BYU for the Big 12. Personally, if I was a TCU fan, I would have higher hopes in winning the lottery, but I suppose it's still a possibility. Looking at the second to last Big 12 team, we have Texas Tech. Texas Tech needs to beat Oklahoma State and West Virginia, then need the familiar story of BYU and Colorado losing out. After that, Arizona State must lose to Arizona, Baylor has to drop at least one against either Houston or Kansas, and Iowa State and Kansas State have to drop at least one apiece. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, actually, I forgot to mention that Iowa State and Kansas State play each other in their last game, which guarantees a win for one of them, meaning the winner of that game would have had to lose their game the previous week. If they both lose this week, that's about the best case scenario for Texas Tech, but they also need BYU and Colorado to definitely lose this week. And I guess it would help if Baylor and TCU drop their game as well, but the odds are slim. The last team on our list is like a cockroach that just won't die. I'm of course referring to West Virginia. Despite not even being bowl eligible, this team somehow still has a shot at the Big 12 championship. Journalists in West Virginia are under the impression that their favorite team is out of Big 12 contention, but sportsbooks are still offering odds on them to win the Big 12, which they don't do when a team is mathematically out. And I have also found ways using the simulator for West Virginia to get in. So good on you, West Virginia journalists, giving up on your team before they're down and out. With that being said, they might be smart to give up now because there's just no chance this thing works out for them. West Virginia has to win out against UCF and Texas Tech. Already the odds are low as they're underdogs against UCF. Then they need BYU or Colorado to lose out. But the team that doesn't lose out can actually win both games if they want. Doesn't matter here. They have TCU on tiebreaker, so TCU can win out for all West Virginia cares. They need Baylor and Arizona State to lose one of their remaining games. Texas Tech can do what they want against Oklahoma State because West Virginia plays them and with a win would be ahead of them. Iowa State has to drop at least one of their games against either Utah or K-State. However, if K-State beats Iowa State, then they will have had to have lost to Cincinnati the week prior, and if Iowa State wins that game, then they will have to lose to Utah. Alright, still with me? Because I know it's extremely confusing. I hope I never have to talk about the Big 12 ever again. But knowing how college football works, it'll probably be even more convoluting next week. West Virginia has, I would say, a 0% chance to actually make the college football playoffs. I included them because they can still get into the Big 12 championship no matter how long the odds, but even if they win, they will still have 5 losses, and I think that number is just insurmountable. And speaking of having no chance to make the playoffs, I'll briefly mention Colorado State, who has maybe a 0.001% chance to get in. They have to win out, win the Mountain West, have Army lose out, have Tulane lose out, but win the AAC, maybe even have Louisiana lose out, and then pray the committee looks down upon them favorably. So there we have it. I apologize for dumping all those Big 12 hypotheticals on you, but honestly, I think it's probably the most interesting conference in the sport right now, with still so much being left up in the air. This weekend should make the picture a little clearer, and more likely than not, it'll come down to BYU, Colorado, Iowa State, or Arizona State, but just having those other teams lurking in the background makes things interesting. For those of you whose team is out and just wants to watch some chaos, I'd say the games this weekend with the biggest playoff implications are Ohio State versus Indiana, Army versus Notre Dame, Arizona State versus BYU, and Kansas versus Colorado. Should be a great Saturday, and as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.